vodka on that night, and everybody decided it was going to be their night.
Hello and welcome to After Dark. Some of tonight's guests doubtless feel they've at times been treated unjustly and unfairly, not by a television program, but by society itself. Beverly Anderson, tonight's host, is welcoming the guests. Today, thousands of people marched through London celebrating 20 years of lesbian and gay pride. It was 20 years ago that a police raid on a New York gay bar in Greenwich Village, called the Stonewall Inn, sparked off a riot. That event is now seen as the beginning of the gay movement throughout America and Europe. It was a signal for men and women to come out of the closet and take to the streets and display their sexuality. Recently, the gay movement has suffered a series of setbacks. The virus AIDS was dubbed by the popular press as the gay plague, and last year saw the introduction in this country of a law banning the promotion of homosexuality in schools. However, some of our European neighbors seem to be taking a more tolerant view towards the gay community. Last month, the Danish parliament voted to allow gay marriages. One of the supporters of that law is a married father of four, Dr. Ole Espersen. He was Minister of Justice in the early 1980s, and he's now the Danish Social Democratic Party's spokesman on legal affairs. Our next guest is a former director of one of Britain's leading companies, Russell Watkin. Public school, the army, and Cambridge prepared him for a successful career in business, but the bedroom and the boardroom are two separate places, and his homosexuality was something he preferred to keep strictly private. Our next guest, Dr. Ismond Rosen, originally from South Africa, is a psychoanalyst who believes that homosexuality is a condition that can be treated. Although a child when the Stonewall riot took place, our next guest was powerfully influenced by it. Computer analyst Jenny Wilson was born in Sydney, Australia, and came to England 7 years ago. She's now director of the Stonewall Group, an organization set up to campaign on behalf of the gay community. When Ken Skeets, a company director and father of four, discovered that his only daughter was a lesbian, he was shocked. Perhaps he'll tell us what then happened. One of the first people to run a high-profile gay club was EastEnder Jo Purvis. She describes herself as a music presenter and claims to be a pioneer of the gay tea dance. Currently entertaining audiences in the West End is Madhouse in Goa, starring Vanessa Redgrave. The author of this play, Martin Sherman, is celebrating a double anniversary this week. It's 10 years since the premiere of his Bent, a hugely successful play about homosexuality, and 20 years ago, he witnessed that riot outside the Stonewall Inn. The guests are settling down. It's After Dark, Pride and Prejudice.
Does Stonewall itself have any meaning for any others of you? Do any of you remember at the time being shocked or impressed by the events that happened outside the club? Or did it not really have any meaning in England? Jo Purvis, were you aware at the time?
I wasn't really aware of it. As Martin says, it was the 60s, all sorts of things were happening. In America, lots more things were happening than in England. I mean, there was all this sort of flower power in happened and that sort of thing, and hippies, and it was just another thing happening in America, and I don't think it was too significant to us at the time.
What was happening in your life?
Well, in my life, I was running this very successful rehearsal club in Soho, where I'd started off as a Sunday club. And the gimmick there in those days was the fact that drag acts were on view to the public for the first time. I mean, there had been drag acts, sort of people like Danny LaRue at the posher clubs in Mayfair, but at our level, you couldn't see a drag act unless you came to the rehearsal clubs. The pubs hadn't started it. And we used to start at 7 o'clock when the bar opened on a Sunday night. People were queuing up at 6 o'clock to see the show we put on. Plus the fact that the Wolfenden Report had happened in 1967 when I opened the rehearsal. And gay clubs, gay men's clubs, were still a little bit worried about letting men dance together. But at the rehearsal, because it was a mixed club, men were dancing together and quite happy about it. And I was so sort of carried away with all this that the fact that we went to 3 times a week from the Sundays and then eventually 4 times, But Stonewall, as I say, at the time meant nothing to me. In fact, I never really realised too much about it until I saw the film that came out a couple of years ago, which impressed me very much.
But were you and your friends surrounded by a lot of hostility or indifference?
None at all.
You were just left?
We were very lucky because we were in London, I suppose. We were also in Soho, which has always been fairly open and cosmopolitan. It was a basement in Soho, right in the middle of it. And as I say, the people that came there, they just came down the stairs and had a bloody good time, and nobody really cared what was happening. They didn't offend anybody on the streets. They just got off the tubes or the buses or their cars and came down, had a jolly good time, went home.
Ole, were you a flower child in the 60s? I mean, 20 years ago, what were you like?
No, but I liked the flower children very much. I was not one myself. I remember the year because it was the first time that a bill was worked out to register partnerships which were not partners or should not be normal marriages. This bill was not passed because it was a bad bill. It was to avoid marriages in general, which was some of the tendencies in the late 60s, of course. So that bill was not passed. I was working myself as a civil servant in the Danish Ministry of Justice at that time.
I see. And at that point, were the sort of activities that were going on in Joe's arena prevalent there too? Were they clubs where people would dance together and have a good time? What was the atmosphere like?
Well, in the 40s and beginning of the 50s, we had clubs where people were dancing together, homosexuals were dancing together. The police was very angry about it. The people around was very angry about it. In the 60s and 70s, there were no difficulties of that nature. But earlier, there had been the difficulties, as you mentioned a while ago. But in the 60s, it was very normal.
Jenny, Stonewall clearly for you has a great significance, but you were a mere infant.
Yes, I was 8 at the time.
A baby. And being gay, did that mean anything in your life at that stage? I mean,
I think at 8 I wouldn't have been able to put my finger on what it was, but I think I was aware that there was something. I think Stonewall itself had a relevance that didn't come to me till much later, probably only about 5 years ago. In Australia, as you may know, we have a gay Mardi Gras much earlier on in the year, towards the end of summer. And that's always been our big gay festival. We've never had a march towards the end of June, as America and a lot of countries in Europe and Britain does. So in effect, until I came over here, I wasn't really aware of the Gay Pride March being a celebration of Stonewall, though I do remember around 12 or 13 reading about it. I think at 8, my lesbian identity wasn't as apparent to me as it became by the time I was 12 or 13. So I can't really say that Stonewall at 8 meant a lot to me.
So I just wonder how far things have changed, do you think, over that time? Russell, 20 years ago, were you a businessman, and how do you think things have changed for you since the days of Stonewall?
Yes, I was a businessman then. I was up north, as it happens, and in Nottingham. And I found that in the provinces, the gay community was quite open. That if you went in a pub, you would meet people who were gay, and it was quite surprising compared with London. I'm not regarding Soho, because that is a law unto itself, but take St. John's Wood, where I live. You would never dream of seeing anything like that. Well, but for myself, I found that in Nottingham, I mixed with the community and became part of the gay community, and it was surprising how many of the people were bisexual that mixed in the community as well. I mean, I won't mention the name of the hotel that was the centre, because it probably may not be gay anymore, but at that time you got every type of person from the community, from bankers to coal miners, who all mixed together quite freely, and it was a very open society, so much so that when I came back to London and people knew I knew Nottingham well, and they said, could I mention where the good gay pubs were? I said, just try the lot. You know, it was a remarkable, even the, I don't want to deprecate the police, but they are known to harass gays, as we know in Earl's Court and that sort of thing, from the incidents that have happened there. But in Nottingham, they were remarkably polite and remarkably tolerant to the whole society, and I think it had to do a lot to do with the Chief Constable of Nottingham at the time.
What about your community? I mean, was it a place where there were known gay clubs 20 years ago? Did people know and leave people in peace, or what was it like?
Well,
where were you living, and was it a big community?
20 years ago,
Yeah.
I lived in a little village in Essex, the village of Nounsley, little hamlet. And strangely enough, it was 20 years ago that I found out that my daughter Jane was gay. It all happened then. I knew nothing about the homosexual community at all. I was just a straight Joe, lived in a village, one pub. Nothing ever happened. Nothing certainly as racy as being gay. And I would imagine if anyone that was gay, openly gay, in the village, would have been hounded to death. It was a very harassing time for me, because I don't suppose I was much different from the other sort of normals around. I might tell you the circumstances, how I found out that, well, I came to know that Jane was gay. As I said, we lived in this tiny village, and it was me and my wife. We had 4 children. Jane was 13. I had 3 boys, Richard, 11, Gareth, 9, and a little boy of 2. We lived in comfortable circumstances. Jane was a very, very bright girl. Normal sort of mothering 13-year-old looking after her 3 brothers. If you like, typical village scene. Nothing to do with the city or anything that was out of the ordinary, cows and sheep and stuff. Anyway, she went to the village school, but as I say, she was very, very bright. And she went to the county high school for girls in Chelmsford. And she used to bring her friends home for the weekend or evenings. And that's it, just about when she was 13. There was one particular girl that had been coming home for a couple of months. Her name's Jill Moon. And they're only little 13-year-old girls. And the arrangement of the house was such that there were 2 large bedrooms upstairs, and we tended to live downstairs, and the children's place was upstairs. It went on for a couple of months, and I had no idea at all. I don't know how I found out. Either there had been some sort of altercation, or Jill or Jane had said to my wife, Pamela, that they were lovers, and that this had been going on for 2 months. I was horrified. Absolutely horrified. I reacted as a, I would think a hick would react. I was shattered. Absolutely. I had no real understanding about what was going on. Big row ensued. Entirely to do with me. My wife accepted fully. The little ones, they didn't know what was going on. And it was ferocious. Absolutely ferocious. I accused my daughter of, oh, I don't know, all sorts of things. I even, to my horror now, I think I even said that she was perverted. It was awful. So what I did was I phoned the school and had an interview with her teacher. see if she could help me. She was no use to me at all. Absolutely none. She was rather embarrassed by the situation. So I had the idea then that even as long as you're determined enough, you can do absolutely anything. Change the world. And I was determined that Jane was going to fulfill my dream of being ordinary sort of girl, get married, have children, and live the ordinary sort of life that I lived. So, because I had no joy with the teacher, I took her to her, kicking and screaming, to a psychiatrist. Well, I didn't take her. My wife Pamela took her. She went with her once, and Jane was highly amused. Now I don't blame her, one little bit. What she said was that I'm just like any other person. There's nothing funny about me. I just have a different sexual preference. And she was right off me, really. I think she hated me at that time. She went once more and refused to go again. It led to a situation where Jane and I were distant for years. We still lived a normal sort of life, but we were distant. There was a barrier between us, and that barrier wasn't broken down for years. I felt it really badly. It was pretty awful.
How did the barrier break down in the end?
It broke down because she went to Warwick University when she was just about 18, and she met a lot of like-minded people. Because I visited her there, I then came to know that they weren't...
They weren't perverts and degenerates.
No, they were just ordinary
Yes.
people living a life, and very interesting people and highly intelligent people. I mean, Jane now lives in, as you know, she lives in Hackney,
Yes.
in a whole colony of lesbians, in Hackney and in Stoke Newington. And you all support each other, and I think you're wonderful.
I had very similar experiences to Jane in that I came out to my mother when I was 12. But she went through the, it's just a stage you're going through, you'll grow out of this. However, it became fairly obvious at school that I was a lesbian and that I was in love with one of my classmates. And the school, for some reason, didn't think it was a stage that I was going to grow out of. And actually, my school made me go to a psychiatrist, and that they wouldn't actually allow me back to school unless I was under psychiatric treatment. So I went to a psychiatrist for 6 months, basically not kicking and screaming because it was a choice of school and psychiatrist or no school, no psychiatrist. And no school, no psychiatrist meant no seeing my lover. So over a period of time, it took about 9 months, I guess, that I was under psychiatric.
I don't think I was born homosexual. I think I was a victim of circumstance.
Joe, can I ask you whether any of this rings bells with you?
Not really, no.
Was your life very
Very
unproblematic?
simple, very unproblematic.
How is that possible?
I think partly because I came from the East End. The East End was very cosmopolitan. Anybody could more or less do anything there. Nobody criticised it. I was an only child. I had a doting mum. I had a father who was very possessive. And I think when he saw I wasn't going to get married, he was quite pleased about it. I never had any problems at school at all. I once went to the doctor with a cold, and my mum was sort of there and said to the doctor something about, oh, while you're curing her, I wish you'd teach her not to wear boys' clothes. This was at the age of about, I suppose, 11 years old, because I used to come home from school and change into a pair of trousers that my cousin had given me, and sort of go around the house sort of saying, oh, I look like a boy now, and all that sort of thing.
Well, Catherine Hepburn did it all her life, didn't
Well,
she?
exactly, yeah. And I did the same sort of thing, I suppose.
But she probably got paid better.
And, yeah, well, I didn't expect to get wages at 11 years old anyway. 6 a week pocket money. And anyway, my mother said, you know, to try and tell her not to wear boys' clothes, become more feminine. And I said to the doctor, and this was at the age of 11 years old, oh, I'm a little boy trapped in a girl's body. And the doctor looked at me and said to my mum, would you like to go out of the room for a minute? And he said to me, now, what is all this? And I said, well, I've been discussing at school with one of the girls, and we've decided that I'm one of these lesbian people that they write about in The Well of Loneliness. And he said, oh, well, are you happy with it? I said, yes. He said, well, there's not a lot I can do about it. Now, I mean, this was a long, long time ago, hundreds of years ago. I was 11 years old at the time. And anyway, he called my mother back and he said, I don't think you've got anything to worry about. Your daughter's quite a good girl. She seems to know her own mind. And that was about the only problem I had till years later when I went into the army. And I'd been in the army a couple of years, and I decided I didn't want to be in it anymore. And I'd heard about all these stories about you could get out of the army, get your ticket, as we called it, by being a gay person or saying you were homosexual. So I trotted off to the doctor and I said, look, I'm a homosexual and I want to see a psychiatrist. And she said, well, how do you know you're a homosexual? I said, because I find it terribly embarrassing to be in a barrack room with all these naked women, and I'm terribly in love with one of my fellow officers and all that sort of thing. I laid it on. It wasn't true at all, actually, because I didn't even look at these ugly birds I was with anyway. But she said, oh, yes, OK, I'll send you to a psychiatrist. So she sent me off to this psychiatrist, and he said, it was a man, incidentally, and they always were in those days. And he said, now, what's your problem? And I said, well, you know, I'm falling madly in love with everybody I look at, and I don't feel comfortable in the army unless I can have a separate room. I'm going to, you know, eventually rape one of my fellow soldiers. And he said, well, has there been any talk about it in the barrack room or anything like that? I said, no. He said, well, it hasn't come to my ears. It doesn't appear to be any scandal about you. I suggest you just go back and wait till there is. And that was the only experience I'd ever had with a psychiatrist. And all this sort of, you know, trying to confess that I was one of these terrible people. Yeah. Nobody took a blind bit of notice or cared.
So how did you get out of the army?
Arthritis. Would you believe? In those days was camp. It wasn't gay, it was camp. Camp meaning outrageous. And we all had a language of our own which we spoke, the Polari, and we could sort of sit on the tube train and talk about the person opposite and send them up rotten, and they didn't even know we were doing it. And as I say, I've always enjoyed my life. Well, I mean, if I haven't, it's because I've either had something really tragic happen, like somebody dying on me, or an arthritic operation on my spine or something. But apart from that, I mean, my sexuality's never bothered me, because I've been accepted for what I am, rather than what I do in bed.
This all strikes you as familiar, does it? I mean, in a way, you're all describing a world which is so easy and accepting that I don't...
No, absolutely not. Listen, first of all, we're here to we started talking about Stonewall, and maybe now we should look at what caused that riot, because it wasn't an easy world, basically. Certainly wasn't in America, which is interesting. Maybe it was easier in America, more difficult in America than here. There are lots of myths about America, about freedom in America. So I'm actually finding this fascinating.
Well, I don't think East London is England as a whole. I mean, as Ken said,
yeah, but as you were talking, I was trying to think of an equivalent in New York, for instance, the Lower East Side. I'm not sure your experience would have been a prevalent one in the Lower East Side at the same time. So this is extremely interesting to me.
So you're saying there isn't an equivalent of the East End in New York?
Well, there is an equivalent of the East End, but I don't know if there's an equivalent of Joe's experience in the.
Well, I did live I lived in Canada actually and visited New York quite a bit. And I'm going back to the 50s when I lived there. And I found again that various friends of mine in New York were particularly having any trouble. Again, I must say that one or two of them were Jewish. And being Jewish, they were outrageous, and they camped around in front of their parents. And the parents didn't seem to care very much.
Wasn't like that with Jewish families in New Jersey.
Well, it wasn't New Jersey, it was the Bronx.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
but
Well,
I was going to say that at that time, or just before that time, when the bill was passed allowing adults, consenting adults, to have homosexual sex in private, there was a feeling at the time, the British one, there was a feeling at the time. I know this because Kenneth Robinson, who had a lot to do with the passage of that bill, who subsequently became the Minister of Health, did a chapter in the book, and we did, his chapter was on parliamentary attitudes, and we were following this all the way through. And there were a lot of people promoting this. Now, the attitude of people was that here was the freedom that people wanted, and they'd got it, and they would have it and enjoy it, and that would be it. There wouldn't be any great hoo-ha, there wouldn't be any great, people wouldn't be marching around the street, shall we say, because sex was a private thing, and that people would have their sexual lives in a private way like anybody else.
As long as they were the only people in the house and it took place behind locked doors.
In that sense, if you like, there were conditions, but if people then went out, as sometimes people did if they got depressed, and they went to a public lavatory and solicited, they were in danger. They knew that. And they still are, yes. Well, I mean, if you go into a woman's lavatory as a man and start peering over the top, which some men do, they're going to get picked up. It's exactly the same.
Sex in a hotel room that they've paid for, they actually break the law. I mean, yes, the 67 Act, actually all it really did was recognise something that was currently taking place. But I can't actually say that it gave gay men anything near equality. They had to be 5 years older than their heterosexual counterparts had to be. They had to be the only people in the place that the sex took place in, which isn't a requirement that heterosexuals have. And it had to be behind a locked door where they couldn't be intruded upon. And nowhere is there a charter on heterosexual sex saying that it has to be between two consenting adults over the age of 21 in a house on their own behind a locked door. So yes, the 67 Act did something, but it didn't do an awful lot.
No, and I think the reason people take to the streets is that there is not full equality. It would be wonderful, absolutely wonderful, if we had a world when our sexual preference would be a private thing. It can only be a private thing when it's publicly accepted. If a member of any profession is able to say, I am homosexual, as he or she is able to say, I am heterosexual, and would not then have professional problems, then the need to say, I am homosexual, would perhaps disappear. But the need is very much there, because it's difficult. It's extremely, extremely difficult. There are enormous social pressures. There are legal pressures. There are certainly media pressures. It simply is not the same. And
let's ask a bit perhaps about what the Danes are doing. Why has it been necessary to bring in this legislation, and what is it doing that hasn't been available to people who are homosexual up to now?
We have had a development within the last 20, 25 years where we have abolished all kind of discrimination, and now we think we can say that in the laws all kinds of discrimination is abolished. What we did a month ago was to introduce, or rather to approve, a bill according to which two people of the same sex can go and have their relationship registered. They don't have to be homosexual, but people of the same sex can be registered as partners. We don't know how to define homosexual. That's difficult, and there's no demand of any cohabitation or the like. But they can be registered, and we did that because we found that it was discriminating that people who love each other, who live together, but are of the same sex, cannot have the same rights and duties as those who are heterosexuals. Now, what this bill, this new law, means is that when they register, and the conditions to do so are the same as if they were heterosexuals, then they have the same duties as people have in a normal marriage. They can inherit each other. They have the same rights with regard to pension. They have the same duties to support each other. They are under the same rules with regard to divorce, for instance. There is one or two differences between the normal marriages. That is that they can't adopt each other's children. The association, the movement wanted that too. But in Parliament we found that this would not be wise to introduce now for various reasons. We can return to that maybe. And the other difference is that the ceremony is not the same, because that would offend too many people's feelings, we felt. But apart from these two differences, all the same effects, legal effects, are realized as if it was a normal marriage. And we did not that only to take up what would be the policy of the movement of the gay people. We think it is and should be a policy in general to avoid discrimination. Because, of course, everybody knows that for centuries, but at least, maybe especially for the last 150 years, there has been a lot of discrimination. There has been atrocities committed, we think, towards homosexuals. Also in Denmark, we don't have a especially good record. We had some terrible years from the beginning of 50s till the mid-60s, where we introduced even more repressive laws than we had before. So what we have done now is to do a little justice to the harm we did at that time. But at the same time, of course, this is the first country which has enacted a law like that. And the debate in Parliament centered very much about being the first country. Many parliamentarians and people in Denmark felt that by doing that, we would get a very bad reputation around in the world, that we took away the basis of the normal marriage. However, from all parties, and we are 9 parties in Danish Parliament, there were votes either for or abstention, and those who abstained were for technical reasons. Only in one party, which is a very small party called the Christian People's Party, all members, that's 4, were against the bill. So it was adopted by 71 votes against 47.
Why do you think people's attitudes have changed in Denmark over the last 20 years or so?
It has changed. We were a little afraid also in my party that it would be very unpopular and maybe cost us some votes. But anyway, you have to take that risk now and then. But we were surprised when there was made a opinion poll which showed that 57% either was in favor of that bill or thought that it was all right with that bill. Only 20% was against the bill. That was very surprising, but very positive, we think. Now, it was enacted 1 month ago, and there's been no trouble since, and we have heard no bad reactions from abroad. It enters into force on 1st of October, and then we'll see how important it will be in practice, and we know that very many people are happy about it.
Do you think the attitude of people who live in Denmark has changed, enabling you to get this bill through in the last 10, 15 years?
I'm sure it has, yes.
Any ideas why?
Well, in general, people are speaking more about human rights, are speaking in favor of non-discrimination, and probably also people have become more tolerant. Many people believed in the 50s that it was a real serious contagious disease which could hurt their children, which could destroy their lives. Many people also believed that being homosexual was more or less, when I say many, I don't know how many, but quite a few at least, that homosexuality was very often connected with being a criminal, or at least could be the first step to become a criminal. There were a lot of prejudices, and these prejudices do not exist now, at least only to a very small extent.
When did homosexuality become legal?
As anything different. I mean, years ago, I remember it well, Queen Victoria said lesbians didn't exist. And because of that, we can get away with murder. We can wear men's clothes, we can wear men's underwear, we can walk along hand in hand with our girlfriends looking like a man, and nobody cares because we don't exist.
It isn't that. The reason they say is because you're not a threat to society.
No, possibly.
That's the reason. Nobody minds.
When lesbians come out about their sexuality, I believe that we frequently get more problems than gay men do because we are more of a threat to a system which is predominantly male-based. lesbians are much more of a threat to that, because what we say to men is that we don't want you, we don't need you.
I think I would have had the same difficulty, and I would have had to learn.
Joe, you haven't said whether you're a feminist. I'm interested.
No, definitely not.
You say that very positively. Why? What is it that makes you not want to be a feminist? Or
Because I'm just a person.
what's that mean?
I mean, I'm me. I live the way I want to live. If I happen to be gay, okay. But primarily, I'm me. And I want to be accepted as me, not particularly as a gay woman or anything else.
And what about the Gay Pride March? Did you go?
No, my legs were bent.
But you would have done.
I'm a bit too old for all that.
Was everybody young? What was it like today?
25,000 people.
And it was terrific.
So they
Who
didn't
were
need
all
me,
very,
did they?
very proud and very, very out and very, very visible, marched along the streets of London, and you won't read about it in the papers, and you won't see it on television,
Right.
and it won't be covered, and it was completely peaceful, and it was a celebration.
It was a celebration. It's never been more of a celebration. It was very, it was warm. It was just warm and loving, but not loving in the old American being kind of ridiculous way, but just genuinely and deeply and truly loving. It was a very, very beautiful day.
So why won't we see it in the press tomorrow? Good pictures,
Because-
I'd have thought.
Of course
It
there's
never
good pictures,
appears
but
in
the
the
press
press.
isn't interested in it. Lesbians and gays don't make good coverage.
What do you feel about the way the press handles the issues of gays in this country, and do you think it's different from the American treatment of the issue?